In this video, I'm going to show you how to use Sytrus so that you can more easily and effectively navigate your way through this plugin and start making your own sounds from scratch. Let's get into it. What's up, my producer friends? It's David with another monsterproductions.com. Now, Sytrus is a stock FL Studio plugin that comes with all versions of FL Studio from the producer edition onward. So that means it does not come with the fruity edition. And this synth is pretty crazy with the amount of different things that you can do inside this plugin. So my goal with this video is to go over all the basic navigation and cover everything that I think is important to cover in this synth. But I want to mention this because if you feel like I've left anything important out of this synth, please leave that in a comment down below. Help the community out by sharing what you know about this plugin with everyone. So I appreciate you for doing that. Also, I do want to mention that if you are feeling like completely lost with some of the stuff that I'm talking about, I'd actually recommend that you check out my Introduction to Synthesis and Sound Design series, which I have here on YouTube. And that's going to cover all the fundamentals and basics of sound design and synthesis. And that should get you caught up to a point where you at least follow along with what we're talking about today. So I'll be sure to put that in the description of this video. I'm also going to include timestamps in the description of this video as well. So if you want to skip around for any reason, or if you're looking for a very specific part of this synth, check the description. And without further ado, let's get straight into it. All right, so first things first, Sytrus is a digital FM synth, and it can actually do more than just FM synthesis. It can also do RM, which is ring modulation. FM, of course, stands for frequency modulation, and it can do additive and subtractive synthesis as well. So very powerful synth. We can do a lot of different stuff, but at its core, it's an FM synthesizer. And the reason why I make the digital distinction is because when it comes to digital FM, as I mentioned, FM stands for frequency modulation, and digital FM is actually not frequency modulation at all. It's phase modulation. So the reason why I tell you this is not to get completely off on a tangent before I even start showing you how to use Sytrus, but it's to point this out because while using this plugin, you may run into some instances where wave shapes or waveforms aren't doing what you'd expect them to do because you're actually modulating the phase and not the frequency. And if you want to learn more about the differences between digital FM versus analog FM and just learn more about digital FM in general, I'm going to leave a link in the description of this video to a podcast, which is a podcast with Seamless, where he talks a little bit more about this in depth. Seamless has a lot of really great tutorials on FM synthesis in general. So check him out if for some reason you're not familiar with them. Now, when you open up Sytrus, chances are you may be a little bit overwhelmed. So we're going to just take this one step at a time. And I'm going to start with this section up here, which is standard for all synths. This is sort of where you can see an arrangement of different things that you can do. You can always scroll through presets, that sort of thing. You can also click this tab here, which is our kind of miscellaneous tab, and we have the ability to do different options here. This is all very standard stuff, so I'm not really going to go into detail about that. Over here, we have the ability to scroll through different presets. Right now, I have it on default preset. You can also go into here and go to default preset that way as well. Now, one step down, as you saw before, we have all these different tabs that we can choose between, and we're going to be going over these in much more detail very soon, but I just wanted to kind of point those out there. Now, we also have these buttons here. So we have some other options. And interesting thing about Sytrus is that you can actually load Yamaha DX7 presets, which if you're not familiar, the Yamaha DX7 is the very iconic synth. It's a keyboard, but it's the first digital synth that uses this phase modulation synthesis that we're talking about here. So you can actually load the Yamaha DX7 presets in here. I personally haven't tried that, so I'm not sure how exact those presets are, but you also have an info tab here, and then you can click to get rid of that. You can also show the block diagram. So it's kind of interesting. You can click to get rid of that. And then we have the ability to toggle the keyboard on or off the plugin with that switch there. Now, fairly recently, they updated this plugin and gave it a new skin, which I'm a big fan of. But along with that update, we actually have the ability to resize this plugin now if you want. Kind of nifty. Now, first things first, I'm actually going to skip over this main tab for now, and we'll kind of come back to that. And I actually want to go to operator 1, and I want to talk about the different wave shapes in Sytrus. So right now we have a sine wave by default. And first of all, we have the ability to right click here and we can choose between our basic wave shapes. So we have a square, We also have a saw, triangle, and sine. Now another cool thing about this plugin is we can actually left click on this and kind of shape the wave shape that we want just by dragging this. And it's kind of cool because as you do that, it'll sort of lock. You can feel it kind of lock when it hits, your basic wave shapes. And then you can go anywhere in between as well. And you may notice that this fader here, our shape fader, is also moving when we do that. So this does the same thing as that. Now we also can mess with the tension of the waveform, which makes the waveform do different things. It's kind of almost like distortion. We also have a skew effect here, which is really cool. Now the only problem with this is you can't automate these, which, it is what it is, but it would be kind of cool if you had the ability to automate this stuff. Another thing you can't automate is the matrix, which is also interesting, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So moving on, this is our sine shaper. It's kind of interesting. It kind of creates a sine wave shape. We have our pre-filter, which is, I guess, kind of like a low pass filter. And then we have our noise as well, which is cool. If we turn it all the way up, it's just white noise. So we could have a strictly white noise operator if we wanted. So I'm going to go back to a sine wave here. And you may have noticed we also have these different shapes down here, which do different things. And the reason for these are, again, going back to kind of what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, where we're actually modulating phase instead of frequency. So these shapes are going to help with that. Gives us some more options there. And actually, if I were to click this one, you can see basically now we just have the half of the sine wave shape and it's all positive polarity. So if I were to play it, you can see everything is positive above this line. So if I wanted to center that, I could actually click this button here. And I've got it turned down quite a bit, so it's kind of hard to see. But basically, we've centered that on that line there. So that's a DC offset removal option there. Now, oftentimes when we mess with the phase of something, especially on a sine wave, we're going to get that click at the beginning of it. And so we can remove that by clicking this declick button. So very easy to do. And then we also have a band limit option, which this is essentially an anti-aliasing filter. And I'm not going to get into what aliasing is in this video because I already know this video is going to be very, very long, but I am going to give you an illustration of how this kind of works. So for example, right now, if I were to go to sine wave, it's not on, but if I were to right click this and go to saw wave, it turns on. Now this can be problematic because if we start with the sine wave and we drag it, it doesn't turn on. So I'm going to show you kind of what this does. So right now, if I play a saw wave and I'm zooming into the higher frequencies up here, so the band limit's on. When I turn it off, we get some aliasing going on there. So you can see that and probably hear that a little bit too as those waveforms come back down there. We have all these extra harmonics there. So you want that on, generally speaking. And while I'm actually talking about aliasing, let's go to our main section. We're going to go over the rest of the main section later. But one thing I want to touch on real quick is that by default, we have basically our oversampling is set to 8 times. And what this means is that this is, again, it has to do with aliasing. So if I were to FM something, it's pretty harsh sound. And what's actually going to happen is because this is set to 8 times oversampling, when you export this, it's going to sound very different. And I can illustrate this. This is our draft mode right now. Let's go to 8. So it sounds quite a bit different there. You can hear how it's getting rid of a lot of those extra harmonics that are in there. So whether or not you want those harmonics in there is kind of irrelevant for this tutorial. It's just a matter of, I just want you to be aware that that is built the way that it is. So if you're building your own patches, just be aware of this, because chances are you may want this to be a 0 as well, so that when you render it, it sounds the same as what you were doing with that. So back to our operator tab here, we can also create a pluck very easily by clicking this pluck button. So that's kind of cool. And you may notice that when I click pluck, over here on our matrix section, it actually makes it so that you can't do any changes to the operator 1 anymore. So I already kind of showed you what phase was, but basically phase has to do with the starting point of the oscillator or wave shape. And the reason why we got that clicking with the sine wave was because instead of starting at 0, it's starting at a weird point, which, kind of creates that clicking sound. We can also click this global tab, which is going to re-trigger the phase for that specific operator. So for example, if I had a bunch of voices of this, like a supersaw or something, this would make all of them start at the same point in the phase, depending on this. So that would re-trigger it. So every time I hit the note, they would start at the same point. I hope that makes sense. All right, so we also have a volume knob here, which controls the volume of that specific operator. So even though we can't actually automate things directly in the matrix, we can just use this volume. Like this is the workaround for that. This is ImageLine's suggested workaround for this problem. So basically how I would do that is, let me just put this back as a sine wave, and then we go to our operator 2. If we were to FM our original sine wave with this other sine wave, like that, basically what we would do is we'd automate the volume knob by, right clicking, going automation clip, but that would get this effect. So essentially we're still having the volume come out of operator 1, but we're automating the volume of operator 2, which is the modulator in this case. Now this PE button here stands for pitch envelope. So this has to do with the pitch. So if we go to our pitch tab here, and then we were to go to like our LFO section or our envelope section really, and then click enable. So the higher it goes, the higher in pitch it changes. And that has to do with this shape here. And again, this could work for the LFO as well. And I am going to get into the rest of the stuff down here shortly, but you may have noticed I haven't really touched on these two things up here. And first of all, this has to do with just frequency. It's measured in hertz. And then this right here has to do with the ratio of the frequency. And I'm so bad at math. I wish I could do a better job explaining the way the ratio works, but just know that this is ratio, this is actual hertz value. So it's cool that they give you the option to do both. I think that's pretty standard for FM synthesis in general. But just to show you an example of what we're talking about here, if I were to set this as 0, nothing would play because I'm set to 0 hertz right now. But I could bring this up to like 82 hertz and we got a sub frequency going on there. I could tune this to A440. So now that's an A. Now the problem with this is any key that I hit is going to be A440. So this can definitely come in handy, but generally speaking, we're probably going to be using the ratio more times than not. All right, so let's talk about the matrix. And for this section, I'm going to be jumping kind of all over the place a little bit. We're going to be covering like little bits and pieces of things, which I will go into in a little bit more detail later on. But basically, I want to sort of explain to you how the matrix works. So it's actually not as complicated as you would expect. It's going to make sense as I kind of, work with it. But essentially, all these numbers line up to each other. And then we have a pan option, we have an effects option, and we have an output. So if I were to turn this off, nothing's coming out. And then if I were to go down here to this, which is our filter 1, and put that out. So now, this is our output, and then this is our filter 1. And then if I were to bring this up, which is our operator 1, so now we got some signal. And then let me just change this to a saw wave. So now you can see our saws being filtered out. So then if I were to go to my filter tab, which I can click here, or, you can click these buttons down here as well, you can see this is my cutoff frequency here. So, and this is our low pass filter in action. And again, we're going to be talking more about the filter tab later on. I just want to show you kind of how this works. So let's just put this right here for now. And then let's say I want operator 2 coming out as well. So I could do this square. So I mean, we can, really get in here and just experiment with it, have fun, get kind of crazy. So now if we wanted to enable some effects, by default, our effects tab is just chorus. So we can actually get rid of that by bringing that down to 0. We can send it directly to our reverb or 3 different delays that we have here. And then we can turn that on and we can experiment with that as well. So hopefully that was a fairly easy illustration of how the matrix works. All right, so the next thing that I want to just kind of briefly go over is our main settings tab here. So we have a global volume or master level, master LFO fader, also master pitch. We have an ADSR section, which is linked to the global volume. And then we also have an ADSR section, which is linked to the filter. Over here, we have the ability to basically do multiple voices. So this is how you would create a super saw. So if I were to go in here, I have my saw wave and I could bring the voices up and then I could bring the detune up. And so this is pretty standard. You can kind of hover over these different knobs and it will pop up exactly what each one of these does. We also have this section down here, which is our modulation section. And it has an XY parameter, which it's linked to the XY parameter, which you see in pretty much any tab you go into. So for example, if I wanted to link my effects section to the mod X, which in this case, we could do like reverb or something like that. If you remember, I just kind of showed you how to go about doing that. And we could do basically a shape like this. And now, so that's the reverb off, reverb on. So that's kind of how that works. We also have an EQ section here, and by default it's off. So this kind of shows you where the EQ targets. So this is out plus effects. So that would be the EQ would be controlling the out, like the effects and the out. This is just linking it to the out only, and then this is just targeting the effects only. So that's kind of how that works. And then everything else should be pretty self-explanatory as far as how an EQ works. You have your bandwidth knob down here, which correlates to each one of these EQ bands here. We already talked about the quality with the oversampling and everything. And then we also have some various other options down here as well. And then finally down here at the very bottom, we have a place where we can actually, if you created a patch, this is where you can put your name or the patch name and the author and details. All right, so now I'm back in my operator 1. And by the way, I didn't mention it, but it should be pretty obvious, but all the operators are the same as far as the interface and what they can do. So the next thing that I want to kind of go over are all of these tabs within the operator section. And this is where things kind of get both confusing and also it's like you have endless possibilities to do anything in this synth. So we have, a pan option, we have a volume option, an input modulation option, we have a pitch option, we have a phase option, we have a plucked damp option, and we even have our own oscillator where this section's crazy. We'll get into that in just a second. And then within each one of these tabs, we have the ability to, adjust the envelope of that section. We also have the ability to adjust the LFO. We can mess with the keyboard mapping. We can mess with the velocity mapping. Again, we can map it to the mod X, mod Y. That's what we just kind of talked about in the main section here. We can do random mapping and we can do unison mapping. So a lot of stuff going on here. Now the envelope may look familiar to you if you've worked with like Fruity Love Filter or this is kind of, I guess, a fairly standard FL Studio looking envelope. So it does give us the visual feedback and we're able to kind of mess with the graph and create our own shapes here. And then you kind of have tabs here. So this is decay, this is sustain, This is the release. Kind of gives us different points. So like I could create a shape here. First of all, you have to click this button to enable the envelope. And you can delete different points too. So now I've just kind of created a pluck there. Same thing goes for the LFO and actually any of these tabs. I mean, you can get in here, you can right click to create points, you can shape stuff, you can get super crazy with it. Now in our oscillator tab, this is where things get really cool because we can actually create our own custom wave shapes by introducing harmonics. This is great for like creating bells very easily. And then down below, this is our phase. So that's a pretty cool feature of this synth. And by the way, you may notice that some of these are darker. That has to do with the octaves. So this is an octave, 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 and so on and so on. All right, so next we're going to be talking about our filter sections. And you may notice that all of our filter sections look the same. As I mentioned, same thing with the operators. However, filter 3, you may notice, doesn't have this button here. And that knob, basically, filter 1 and filter 2 have it. It controls the amount going into the next filter. So you can actually have the filters feeding into each other that way. Now, going to filter 1, if you remember, if I wanted to enable this, I would do that in the matrix by having the output go there. I'll just take the output off there, and then bringing the filter up like that. So right now I have a saw wave on operator 1, and I'm filtering out some of the frequencies. We have a state variable filter going on by default, and it's low passing essentially. So we can actually get kind of crazy with this filter. Like we can mix or just do high pass filter, or straight low pass, whatever we want to do. There are, I think, 13 filter types in total, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you do have your standard filter types, so that's pretty cool. Now over here we have the ability to turn the filter off if we want. We can also switch between different filter types or like slopes, for example. So like this one times 1. Here, let me bring this up. Times 2. You can kind of see over here it's filtering out a little bit more frequencies. And then you have alternate to alternate. So that just gives us more filter options there. Moving on to this knob here, this controls the cutoff envelope amount. So if I were to go into my cutoff tab here and enable this, kind of get some, this is 0, this is 0%. So that's kind of cool. This is, of course, our frequency cutoff. I've been messing with this knob for the entire tutorial. So, and then of course we have a resonance knob as well, which basically just gives it this sort of cue effect at the top of where the filter starts actually taking effect. So that's what resonance is. Moving over here, we actually have like a wave shaper built into Sytrus in the filter section. So if I were to turn this on, it takes you to the wave shaper tab. This is distortion. So we have kind of a preamp thing going on here, and then we also have a mix amount as well. We also have the ability to change between unipolar and bipolar, which gives us just more options to kind of shape stuff in weird ways, which, might be kind of fun. So moving on to these tabs here, this is very similar to what we kind of talked about in our operators. We have a pan option, we have a volume, or we talked about the filter cutoff frequency option. We also have a filter resonance, we have the low, we have the band, we have the high. So all this stuff is kind of, similar to these knobs. We can just get in here and get super crazy with it, Then we have our wave shaper, which we talked about, and we also have our wave shaper mix. And again, within all of these tabs, we have all of our different options, which just gives us unlimited flexibility to do all sorts of crazy things. So that's cool. So I kind of have showed you how to shape things and potentially get rid of stuff. You can delete points. You can add points by right-clicking and bending stuff and getting super creative and crazy with it. You can also do it just by messing with these knobs here with the attack, decay, sustain, and release. We also have a global retrigger and a tempo knob there. We also have an undo button, so if you wanted to add something and then undo it, that's how you do that. And here's another thing that they actually give you the option to do. You can go in here and we have even more that you need to know about, but mainly we have a bunch of different presets which we can choose from. So we have art presets, we have gate, pitch arpeggiator, like all sorts of just different things that we can choose from. So like if I did a gate, so that might be something that you guys may potentially want to experiment with as well. So next, let's talk about our effects section here. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier in the tutorial, but by default, when you implement some sort of effect, it gives it a chorus effect, and we can change that by bringing that down to 0. So that gives us 0 chorus, but then it automatically is sending it into this, assuming that we have our send level turned all the way up. You can turn this down if you wanted to, but by default, nothing is really on anyway, so it shouldn't really matter. But basically, if we wanted to turn like reverb on, you just click this on button, and then you can mess with the low cut of it, the high cut, the pre-delay, the room size, reverb diffusion, reverb decay. We have high damping, and then we have a wet volume knob here. So same thing goes with delay. These are all the same. They're just 3 different delays that we have the option to choose between. So again, you can turn it on. By default, it's synced to the tempo, which, you can potentially change that. So we have some pretty basic delay parameters here. And then we also have the ability to switch between these different delay types as well. So in our effects section, we have a pan tab and then a volume tab and all these, sections that we've talked about before. Anyway, all very cool stuff. I hope you liked this video. I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned a little something about Sytrus, and hopefully now you can dive in and actually start making some sounds. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. Don't forget to hit the bell notification. That's going to let you know anytime I release videos in the future. At the moment, I am doing a lot of FL Studio related videos and specifically a lot of sound design type stuff as well. So be sure to check out the channel for some other videos that might be interesting for you as well. And I will see you in the next video.